1982 was not the best time for gaming. 2 generations in, and the video game industry was already on the verge of a major crash. This was caused by many factors, such as a flooded console market — there were about 12 consoles at the time — competition from home computers such as the Commodore 64 and Apple II, inflation, a loss of publishing control, which resulted in a glut of poor quality games from companies that weren't even game companies. Even had dog food companies making games that were really just promotions for their products. And lastly, the crash was also caused by high-profile failures, one of which we'll be covering. There were 2 games in particular which are seen as the hair triggers of the video game crash of 1983. There was E.T., which was plagued by glitches, lousy hit detection, complicated gameplay that you needed the manual to figure out, and a needlessly frustrating difficulty. The other was Pac-Man. Yes, Pac-Man. Now you're probably wondering, okay, how the fuck did Atari manage to screw up a game like Pac-Man? After all, it's a simple game about a circle, going through a maze, eating pills and occasionally fruit, while evading 4 colorful ghosts. Should be impossible to screw up, right? Well, somehow they managed. Allow me to explain. One of the big issues during development was dealing with software and hardware limitations. Atari chose to use a 4KB ROM cartridge instead of the newly available 8KB cartridge, while the boards of the arcade version stored 16KB of ROM memory. That and the arcade version had about 2KB of general RAM, while the Atari 2600 itself had only 128 bytes of RAM. Basically, the developer had to make a few changes, like simplifying the design of the maze. Now, fair enough. I understand that developers had to make changes when bringing an arcade title to the system. I don't expect a perfect translation of an arcade game made in 1980 onto a console made in 1977. That has hardware inferior to any arcade game made in its time. No matter what arcade game you bring to the 2600, there's going to be some changes. In some cases, it's only graphics-wise, and in others, it's in gameplay or level design. The 2600 version of Donkey Kong is a perfect example of this. It's missing 2 stages, and the last stage had to be slightly redesigned. Now with that said, how do you go from this to this? Let me talk about graphics for a second. I usually don't judge graphics on Atari games, mainly because gaming had just evolved beyond Pong and graphics on the early 2nd-gen systems like the Atari 2600 and Intellivision were very simplistic. It wasn't until the later 2nd-gen systems like the ColecoVision and Atari 5200 where systems started to make a push towards better graphics. So, really, I find it rather unfair to judge the graphics of a game on a console launched in the late 70s. However, in this game's case, I have to make an exception. In this version of Pac-Man, we have an ugly color scheme with mud brown walls and wafers on a bright blue background. The issue with the background is that the ghosts have pale colors that you really have to look closely to tell apart and flicker constantly. Keeping track of these ghosts can be painful on the eyes, and considering that each individual ghost shows up every 4 frames, the game can also play tricks on your eyes regarding their speed and movement. I know the flickering ghosts were due to memory limitations, but I'm not giving Atari a pass on this. They chose the 4KB ROM cartridge. They had the option to choose the 8KB ROM cartridge. If they had, maybe they would have made less stupid decisions. The maze itself is extremely cluttered. In the original Pac-Man, even though the paths were longer, the maze still gave you plenty of room to move around, and you had an easier time avoiding the ghosts. In this version, the maze is so full of walls and corners that it's rather difficult to maneuver, and it's quite easy to walk into an ambush. Also, the escape paths that bring you to the opposite side of the map just feel inconvenient in this version. See the top path with the walls jutting out on either side of it? If you have to use the escape path and there's a ghost or 2 on the top half, that can easily serve as a trap. The rest of the problems I have with this game admittedly are just nitpicks. Like Pac-Man not turning his head when moving up or down. And I don't like how they replaced fruit with that square. Though I have to say, I like how you can gain an extra life every time you clear a maze. That's the only complaint I have about the original Pac-Man. You have nothing to help prolong your gameplay if you're really skilled at the game like you do in Galaga, Donkey Kong, or Mario Brothers. All you get is one extra life when you hit 10,000 points, and that's it. That's just me though, I guess for others that just adds to the challenge. This version of Pac-Man ended up selling 7 million copies, becoming the best-selling home video game of the second generation. However, due to its poor reception, it damaged Atari's reputation, and people started to lose faith in Atari's games. Atari addressed the complaints by making great versions of Miss Pac-Man and Junior Pac-Man for the 2600, and an arcade-accurate version of Pac-Man for the Atari 5200. But by that time, its reputation was severely damaged. The real kicker, though? Despite being the best-selling video game of its time, Atari still didn't make their money back. Why? Because they were so confident that this game would sell that they made more Pac-Man cartridges than there were Atari 2600 consoles. That's 12 million copies to 10 million consoles, and they sold 7 million. So that's 5 million copies left unsold. Atari's poor management, everyone! That is probably one of the most stupid decisions that a company has ever made in the video game industry. Now, even though there are much better platforms to play Pac-Man on, if you still want a good experience with Pac-Man on the 2600, have no fear, for there is a better Pac-Man.